panelists are going to be doing 5 minutes, and we'll be introducing them in a second. I also want to just maybe give, especially for those of you who are joining us now for the first time, a little bit of background on why we're doing this conference and what it's about and what the concept of civil society means. I'll do the first part, and I'll invite Julia to pitch in on the concept of civil society and its relevance to this broader discussion. I've spent a lot of my career doing international development work, and one of the things that a civil society, the idea of a civil society brought to the table was the concept that organizations and good programs can fail for reasons other than the merits or capacity of the organizations or the benefits and features of the programs themselves. In other words, that there are factors in the external environment that can operate to disable or disenable civil society organizations from effectively functioning. During the Harper years, it became painfully obvious that many of the places that I had worked and many of my colleagues and friends had worked internationally, many of the stories that we brought home were suddenly becoming familiar stories back in Canada. Not to the same extent, of course, as one might see in developing countries or countries that are coming out of emerging from civil conflict, but stories that would occur in other countries in terms of governments repressing civil society organizations, vilifying civil society organizations, making it difficult or impossible for them to accept international or foreign funding, using the regulatory framework in order to impede their functioning. All of these things started happening surprisingly and disturbingly in Canada. And before I turn it over to Julia, I just want to maybe recount a quick anecdote. When I was working in Sudan in 2010, 2011, I was asked to meet with the Deputy Res Rep of the UNDP at the time, who wanted to have a serious discussion with me about what I thought was going to be a conversation about the program that we were running in Sudan and some of the issues that they were encountering around migration of debt assistance to South Sudan, another story. Anyway, make a long story long, I get to the office of the UNDP and we sit down, and he looks at me and he says, okay, before we talk about our program, what is going on in Canada? I'm sitting in Khartoum with a guy who is also African, and he's asking what is going south in Canada. So that was a real wake-up call in terms of a number of civil society organizations actually starting to mobilize and also to connect and theorize the idea of an enabling environment in a way that made sense for lawyers, that connects it to fundamental freedoms, that connects it to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Values, but also connects it to ideas around innovation, safe spaces, the panel we just finished, this idea that we need to create spaces and places where we can have these conversations in a way that actually facilitates civil society. And maybe I can ask Willie to talk about some of the work that they've been doing at CCSE.
Thank you. Sorry, people. I think all our chairs are taken. There's one more over here. There's two more over there.
And that's actually where I was sitting. So
there's another one here too. Please come in and have a seat. Thank you. So two more chairs over here as well, and two here. Okay, so thank you, Pearl, for that. So just very briefly, for those of you who are joining us this evening, we've spent a better part of the day expanding on two basic concepts. One, which is the enabling environment for civil society. Our conference today was called Enabling Civil Society. So the whole idea, or the premise, is that in order to have viable, vibrant, progressive, successful societies, we need to make sure that civil society, so the groups that are not government, the way we define civil society is also not private sector, but the sometimes called voluntary sector, the charities, the organizations that are groupings of citizens coming together around different causes, different projects, that is essential for successful societies, and that we need to make sure that there is an enabling environment, that the laws that are in place, regulations, that there are good, that they have access to funding and support, that they're recognized in their role, many roles that civil society plays, including being active participants in shaping public policy. So the premise of this whole discourse around enabling civil society is that that is a necessary ingredient for successful societies, and therefore we need to be working towards creating a facilitating, enabling environment for civil society. So we've been talking about that and the fact that, unfortunately, around the world, as I'm sure you'll hear from our panelists, we are seeing a growing recognition that this is important, that civil society is key, and that also providing an enabling environment or ensuring an enabling environment for civil society is important. And yet, at the same time, we see a growing number of countries adopting legislation, for example, that actually disables civil society, that creates barriers for civil society to realize its role. So related concept to that is this idea of civic space that Pearl mentioned. So it's that space where civil society organizations, movements can perform their contributions to society, that civic space. We hear very often, you've probably all heard, the expression of shrinking civic space. So it's the same idea that because we don't have these enabling environments, the space for civil society to act is actually shrinking metaphorically, sometimes physically, but more metaphorically, becoming very constrained, right? So these are things that preoccupy us, and so our discussions today have been kind of unpacking that, making references to what's happening in other countries. We had a colleague with us today from the United States. It was very interesting to hear his perspective, having worked overseas, like Pearl says, in addressing enabling environment challenges in other countries, to all of a sudden find himself working in the States, facing many of the similar issues. So we've been doing that today, and we really look forward tonight to engaging a broader group of people in a conversation around these international trends, what's happening around the world. We have statistics. I'm not sure if I'm going to steal any thunder here, but we have organizations around the world that are monitoring civic space and enabling environment, and the trends are not positive. We're actually seeing a diminishing space, increasing number of countries that have disenabling environment, and so it is a concern. A colleague this morning talked about the democratic deficit that is generating as a trend. So I will leave it at that,
and we'll introduce our speakers. So starting from my immediate right is someone who will likely need very little introduction to many of you, Alex Neve, who's Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada, sharing the senior leadership with the Executive Director of that organization. He's the primary spokesperson for Amnesty, and among his many other duties has participated in Amnesty's missions to South Sudan, Côte d'Ivoire, Tanzania, Ghana, Mexico, Burundi, Chad, and a number of other countries. He's also chair of the board of directors was chair of the board of directors and still actively engaged in the Canadian Centre for International Justice, and is engaged with a number of other organizations. And as I said earlier this morning, Alex, in addition to his impressive background with Amnesty and his international experience, has also been a real catalyst for human rights and civil society organizations in Canada. And he's going to be talking, I believe, about human rights defenders and some of the connections between the Canadian and the international sphere, and helping us to weave those protections into both international and domestic protections. Françoise Girard, in the middle, is president of the International Women's Health Coalition, an advocate, a renowned and well-regarded advocate for women's rights and sexual and reproductive health and rights. She's a lawyer by training, and served as the director of the public health program at the Open Society Foundations from 2006 to 2011. And she's going to be talking to us, among other things, about what is happening with women's health, NGOs, and civil society internationally. But also, we're hoping to hear a little bit from her about her thoughts on the Canadian Feminist International policy that was launched to great acclaim by the current Liberal government, and how that is playing out internationally. And last but not least, François Prébeau, full professor of the Hans Tamar Oppenheimer Chair in Public International Law here at the faculty, also director of our partner here, the McGill Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, is about to head off into the distance, at least to Belgium, to take up a chair in Louvain shortly. Well, perhaps not immediately, but soon. Oh no, it's not coming back. He is coming back. He is coming back.
No, not forever. It's only for 6 months.
Yeah. He is coming back.
My
Everybody
team
breathe
would
a
have
shot. He has an extremely long list of accolades and recognitions that I'm not going to repeat, but he will be talking to us about, among other things, his role as Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Migrants, the United Nations Special Rapporteur role that he ended relatively recently. And on a personal note, I want to say that François and I go back a long way, back to the wars of the 1980s and the human rights movement, and how we recharacterized it in very new and different times. And François was really, I think it's important to say in the context of this conference, one of the first scholars in Canada who really started working at the nexus of human rights and migrants. You know, in Canada, we often thought about this idea of immigration and migrant, and refugee rights in a silo, and then human rights were over here, and if you were a citizen, you got these human rights, unless you were Aboriginal, of course. The silo was here, and migration rights were over here, and the twain never met. And François really was one of the thinkers and scholars and practitioners, I think it's fair to say all three, who really started bringing all that together. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask Alex to lead the charge.
Thanks very much, Pearl, and thank you to all of you for joining us. This is very heartening to see so many people out. The title for our presentations this evening poses a question. Civil society at risk? It's on an exclamation mark, it's not a period, it's a question. So I'm going to begin by not keeping you in suspense. The answer is yes. Actually, the answer is yes. It's a very emphatic and very concerned yes. And I want to begin by illustrating that just by very quickly sharing with you just 3, and I actually could share 20 preoccupying encounters in my own work life and friendships just over the past week that I think really underscore it. A week ago Friday, I had a very poignant and long overdue reunion with a dear colleague, a man from Burundi named Pierre Claver Bopimpa, who founded a fabulous organization in Burundi known as the Association pour la protection des droits humains et des personnes détenues. And Pierre Claver and I had spent 3 intense weeks together back in 2005 when he joined an Amnesty International mission that at the time traveled to just about every corner of Burundi, the first time we'd been able to travel quite freely there in a long time. And it was a momentous time in Burundi. There was actually, believe it or not, there was actually quite a hopeful, there was a sort of a prospect of peace and stability at the time, obviously, not how you would describe Burundi now. And I came to know a man, an incredible human rights defender, who clearly was deserving of adulation of the highest order. Last Friday, I reunited with a man who in the past 3 years has been imprisoned. He's been brutally attacked. His son and his son-in-law have both been assassinated for reasons almost certainly linked to his own activism, and he now lives in exile in Belgium. Over the weekend, in Ottawa, in Montreal, across the world, Amnesty International supporters held parties and posted online greetings to celebrate the birthday of a treasured colleague, essentially the woman who does my job in Turkey as director of Amnesty International Turkey, Idil Eser. Well, Idil has been locked up behind bars for over 100 days now, since early July. Idil is not the only Amnesty International leader imprisoned in Turkey. The chair of Amnesty International Turkey's board of directors, who's also a human rights lawyer by day, he's been jailed since the beginning of June. And 9 other leading Turkish human rights defenders are also imprisoned at this time. And then on Wednesday of this week, I spent the day hearing firsthand in Ottawa from a truly humbling group of 10 human rights defenders who are all in different ways working to end the human rights crisis, and that absolutely is what it is, in Mexico. And they take action across a wide range of concerns: torture, disappearances, violence against women, abuses connected with the mining sector, labor rights, media freedom, etc. It was a long list. One of the group, Gustavo Lozano, who's with the Mexican Network of Communities Affected by Mining, starkly brought the challenges he faces close to home for us as Canadians, noting that Canadian mining investment is everywhere in Mexico, and that activists and community leaders like himself who oppose a particular mine or simply ask questions and seek information do so, as he described it, playing with their lives. So Turkey, Burundi, Mexico, about 25 women and men in those three particular instances, whose lives and background are obviously in many respects worlds apart, but for two very powerful threads that draw them all together. First, they are all human rights defenders, and second, they are all under siege. And under siege simply because they take seriously one of the most precious responsibilities we all share, and that is at the heart of civil society work in so many ways, and that is standing up for our shared universal human rights. It was not supposed to be like this in 2017. You know, about 20 years ago, leaders gathered in Paris to mark the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And they marked that milestone by adopting a new international instrument with a long and unwieldy title that I'm only going to mention once. It's the UN Declaration on the Right and Responsibilities of Individuals, Groups, and Organs of Society to Promote and Protect Universally Recognized Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. I didn't know if I'd be able to do that in one breath. 19 years later, the world knows it as the Human Rights Defenders Declaration. And that declaration enshrines a principle that is at the very heart of universal human rights protection in Article 1. It's short. Everyone has the right, individually and in association with others, to promote and to strive for the protection and realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms at national and international levels. It's the other side of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in many respects. In 1948, governments laid out the vision, the principles and commitments of universal human rights protection. And then in 1998, they made it clear that everyone, all of us, that means, of course, every single one of us, has the right to turn that promise of human rights protection into reality. Well, it was only supposed to get better from 1998 onwards, but the reality has been exactly the opposite. And just listen to a few of these recent grim statistics. Last year, we documented the killing of 281 human rights defenders in 22 countries. That's up 80% from the year before. Bringing it close to home, in this hemisphere, 75% of those who were killed in 2016 were in the Americas. In 63 countries, governments launched smear campaigns against human rights defenders. In 68 countries, human rights defenders were arrested solely because of their peaceful human rights work. And in 94 countries, human rights defenders have faced threats and attacks. The patterns are increasingly common worldwide. Governments adopt new laws and policies that make the work of human rights defenders riskier and more difficult. For instance, laws that authorize the use of force against peaceful protesters, laws that allow mass surveillance, laws banning access to foreign funding for human rights organizations in countries where there's no other resources available, laws imposing stringent, often impossible registration requirements. Human rights defenders are labeled more and more openly as criminals, undesirables, defenders of demons, one of my favorites, foreign agents, anti-nationals, terrorists, threats to security, development, or traditional values. And there is nothing isolated or occasional about any of this. There's a UN-level expert who focuses on human rights defenders. It's a post that goes back to 2000. 3 people have held it. The current special rapporteur, a man named Michel Forst, a former Amnesty International leader himself, in his report this year had an incredibly, I thought, powerful and poignant beginning to the report that summarizes how urgent this crisis has become. And I just want to share his words with you. After spending the past 3 years traveling around the world and documenting the situation of human rights defenders, this special rapporteur is more appalled than ever to see attacks against them multiplying everywhere, assailing bloggers, Indigenous peoples, journalists, community leaders, whistleblowers, and community volunteers. Furthermore, the Special Rapporteur has become convinced that the incidents in question are not isolated acts, but concerted attacks against those who try to embody the ideals of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of a world free from fear and the world realizes that such people are the lifeblood of our democracies, who help us to flourish and survive over time. And as the politics of hate and division